May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The beginning of November forms a part of the Church's year called Remembrance Time. This incorporates All Souls, where we remember those that we love that have died. We celebrate All Saints, which we did last week, remembering those that have gone before us in faith. For us here, we remember St. Martin. It's actually his feast day today, although, as you can imagine, it often gets overlooked. And that's because today, as you can see, it's a special day, Remembrance Sunday, where we remember all victims of war and those who have sacrificed their lives for the freedom of others. All of these festivals have remembering at their heart. Memory is perhaps the most personal experience that there is. There are numerous studies which demonstrate that if a group of people all experience the same event, they will all have a different memory of it. Memory is something that we often don't have control over. We may smell a particular perfume or food and find ourselves instantly transported back to a particular time or place. We may hear a particular song and always connected with an old friend or perhaps old flame that we've lost touch with. Memories can be triggered by the strangest things, and we don't always have control over this. Of course, memories are not always positive reminiscences of the past. Memories can be intrusive. Many people who have had traumatic experiences, including as a result of the horrors of war, live with a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It was formerly described as shell shock. People with this condition are often held captive by their memories, repeatedly forced to relive them through flashbacks and nightmares. Memories are not always the rose-tinted gift that we imagine. Today in particular, we are remembering the end of the First World War 100 years ago today. It is not a remembering that is triggered by something unexpected. And though the events we remember are unpleasant, they are not forced upon us by our biology. Remembering as we do today is something we choose to do. And yet that moment when peace was declared 100 years ago is something that none of us remembers firsthand. I would like to share a memory of this that is not my own. It is the memory of somebody that I love that has died, and somebody that went before me in faith. My great-gran. She was born in 1903 and died in the year 2000 at the age of 97. I was 13 when she died, and we were very close. She would look after me while we were in Newcastle, either while we lived here or visiting every single holiday. She would tell me stories about her life and great moments in history, and I feel incredibly privileged that I have these second-hand memories. She told me of the day when she was 15 years old, when the head teacher came into her classroom just before lunchtime to tell the class that armistice had been declared and they were no longer at war. They were then told that there would be no celebrations, but that the rest of the school day would be spent in silence, remembering those that had died. Every child in the school would have personally known people that had died, including parents, siblings, neighbours, friends. The list could have been endless. When I was told this as a child, I couldn't imagine spending a whole day in silence, contemplating the enormity of that loss, as well as envisioning a future, the like of which some of the children in that school would struggle to remember, a time of peace. They were expecting it to be a peace that lasted, the war to end all wars. As Christians 100 years later, the task of remembering victims of war is something we take seriously. Sadly, we do not live in a time where war is a distant memory. But perhaps in this country, many of us are insulated to its reality. Unless we know servicemen and women personally, or we come from a country that has been in the midst of war, we might be fooled to think that war is something that goes on elsewhere and doesn't disrupt our lives. War is perhaps the ultimate disruption because it damages every level of society. It causes political upheaval on an international scale, forces huge national change, whether it be conscription or migration, availability of resources. Potential consequences are endless. War causes towns to be razed to the ground. War takes away people's home life through the absence of a partner who is away fighting, losing one's home, or of course, the loss of a much-loved part of a family or community. Even when we zoom down to look at the effects of war on a single person, the devastation seems to be magnified. Death, bereavement, loss of independence, changed futures. Part of what makes remembrance such an emotional time is that it cannot be neatly packaged. Conflict is messy. As well as those throughout the decades who have shown great bravery and sacrifice by serving in conflicts, there are those whose lives have been scarred by war in other ways. There are those who stayed at home, worrying, and particularly during the world wars, engaging in dangerous war work themselves. There are those who have been injured or succumbed to disease or the mental consequences of violent conflict. There are those who have been imprisoned for refusing to fight, and even children separated from parents and forced to become soldiers. There are those who have suffered when sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war, as well as other forms of torture. There is so much to remember in the past and present, at home and abroad. Can we even bear the weight of it? Not alone, I suspect. We may be comforted by the fact that war, despite what I said earlier, is not the ultimate disruption. God is. God is the ultimate disruption. In our first reading, we had part of the story of Jonah. He was perfectly happy living without God's interference. He went to such lengths to escape God that he ended up in the belly of the fish. However, he couldn't escape God's call to warn the people of Nineveh to change their ways or face destruction. Much to Jonah's annoyance, the people do repent and God forgives them and they are spared, making Jonah look foolish. God called Jonah from his life to be a laughingstock so that others could be saved. It is clear that sacrifice takes many forms. From this story, we can also trust that God can redeem even the most hopeless of circumstances. Jonah is just one example of a biblical figure who had their life interrupted by God. We also heard about the first calling of the disciples. The fishermen, Simon and Andrew, are minding their own business, going about their work, catching fish. And Jesus comes along and says those words, "Follow me." With little more, their lives are utterly transformed, and they follow Jesus, becoming his disciples. Imagine how different their lives would have been if Jesus had gone another way, or if they'd have said, "No thanks mate, I'm busy," or any number of more likely scenarios. The disciples were called to be Jesus' followers and friends. This one little disruption changed the course of their lives. It set the pattern for every person that has decided to become a follower of Jesus since. If we are to take Jesus' teaching seriously, there is no following him without disruption. At times this may be annoying, may mean our choices go against the grain, but I promise there is no greater joy than God interrupting us to put us on the right track and make us whole. As well as the horrifying disturbance of war, the glorious disruption of God breaking into our lives, I'd like to reflect a little on another disruption. It is one that we choose, but it still forms a break in the order of our normal lives. And that is our act of remembrance today. We have chosen that it is not right for us to go about our day-to-day without paying our respects to the victims of war. We have decided to remember what for some, perhaps most of us, is unrememberable. We are stopping because the scar of war that runs down the generations, we are all in need of healing in one way or another. However, because of the way that God breaks into our broken world, as Christians we must remember, but we must also act. Perhaps Jesus' most radical commandment was that we should live in peace with one another. We may not be able to impact global politics, and we will all have differing views on how best to protect the vulnerable in times of conflict. But along with our remembering today, we must not forget that Jesus taught us that for humanity to be whole, we must live in peace with one another. We will all have had periods of our lives, perhaps we're in one now, where there is no war, but no peace is to be found either. Maybe a case of harsh words, grudges, and even more sadly, we may be living with violence. It's at those times that Jesus comes to us and says exactly as he did to the fishermen, "Follow me." The world has not yet learned to live in peace, but Jesus did. It makes sense that if we want to learn how to do it, we need to get as close to him as possible. We need to follow him. On a day like today, it is right that we are overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering that brave people have borne throughout the years. As well as looking back, it is natural to look around our world today, still so full of struggle, and be aware of the lack of peace in our own lives. But we must also look forward. because God's will to bring peace into this world is infinitely greater than any battle or hardship. Despite all the suffering the world has seen and is seeing, Jesus still interrupts and gently whispers, "Follow me."